This is Tall Tale TV, your podcast for sci-fi and fantasy short stories. The Christmas Commodore, Part 2 of 2 by Lesley Herron, a Tyrants and Teakettles holiday short story. Chapter 2, Jingle Jolly.
Hang on!
Vel dug his metal fingers into the gaps between the wooden planks of the ship, fighting to keep himself on board the out-of-control vehicle. His other hand wrapped tight around Piper's outstretched fingers in hopes to keep her from flying off the death machine.
"What do you think I'm doing, old man?"
Piper shot back as she looked over her shoulder to check that her brother hadn't been tossed from the sleigh. The captain and his first mate slid past her as the mechanical hamsters hopped the curb and the sleigh slammed into a vendor tent, sending a cascade of shoes and linens into the air.
Hey, don't get snippy with me!
Vel shook away the several socks that had blinded his vision to see flashes of wide-eyed faces poking their heads out of window curtains and door frames as they passed.
You're the one who insisted on coming!
The hamsters veered sharply to the left, and the vehicle careened into another vendor tent, this time spraying them with a myriad of perfumes and colognes. Piper sputtered, choking around the discordant medley of smells. She opened her mouth to respond, but it was cut quickly from her throat as the hamsters shifted position again, causing the right sleigh runner to hit the curb. The ship bucked hard, and for a split second, she hung motionless in the air before she was thrown back to the ice-covered deck. She groaned and looked back up at the cyborg.
"There was no way I was going to let you take Atticus and not me."
Atticus sparked a laugh from somewhere near the back of the vessel.
"Look, Piper, no hands!"
A decision he almost immediately regretted as the ship swerved on a patch of ice and he was thrown into Leon and Scribner, knocking them apart like bowling pins. Piper winced as her body hit the deck again.
"Get us out of here!"
Vel finally managed to wrap his mechanical fingers around the gilded railing and pulled himself up to his knees. The streets ahead of them were free from citizens, presumably in their haste to seek shelter from the storm. The cold stung at his open eyes, and the growing ice crystals bit at his cheeks. The snow was building, blinding his vision, but he could tell they were running out of road. The flapping of the reins caught his attention, and he lunged for them. Vel twisted them around his mechanical wrist and hauled back. Too little, too late. The hamsters scrabbled to avoid the river, but the vehicle kept going. It jackknifed around the mechanical critters, and the metal sleigh runners hit the bank of the river, threatening to toss its contents into the icy waters. The inertia of the ship pulled the frightened animals down atop the frozen surface of the river. Vel let out a frustrated grunt as he shoved a bruised and battered first mate off him and yanked back on the reins. From his prone position, he could tell the hamsters were at the complete mercy of the ice, and he just prayed it was thick enough not to crack. The animals pulled and scrabbled, rocking the ship back and forth until the lead hamster hit the far bank and regained its footing. Just in time, too, he thought, as he felt his stomach churn. The sudden change in direction, however, caused the ship to whip back in line and toss them along the deck until they slammed into the other side. Unit 2, weighing far more than everyone else, was thrown clean overboard and landed headfirst into a sizable snowbank, his treads spinning uselessly above him. The flurries of snow continued to darken, limiting Vel's vision. Luckily, Amy was outlining their surroundings in a red wire framework, allowing him a general idea of what was happening around them. He could tell the hamsters were steering them straight to the college, and they were barreling down the street, picking up speed. He cursed under his breath and jerked back on the reins still wrapped around his metal hand, attempting to slow them down. He was unsure if the leather had become too brittle or if the frigid air had dulled his fine motor skills, but the reins snapped under the weight of his pull, and he toppled backwards.
"Oi! Get off me peg leg, you land-loving son of a toaster oven!"
Scribner shoved the cyborg off him.
"Who taught you to steer? A blind man?"
Vel growled and shot the pirate a hateful scowl as he shoved the remnants of the reins into his grubby hands.
"If you'd like to drive, be my guest."
Piper adjusted her grip on the port side railing, fighting the urge to verbally and physically chastise the cyborg and pirate as they fought. But as her gaze flickered towards the front of the ship, she felt the slew of colorful curses die on her lips.
Look out!
Vel felt that pit return to his stomach as he looked in the direction the girl was indicating. Out of the gloom of the frenzied storm, he could see the shadow of the college looming near. The hamsters barreled on, straight through the front gates. The brick wall surrounding the college, however, was not as accommodating to the large vessel. One of the sleigh runners slammed into the thick stone, and just like that, the metal beams were stripped from the vehicle, and the Christmas Commodore sleigh was airborne. The mechanical critters scattered throughout the courtyard, having finally broken free from their harnesses. A muddled cry of panic shattered the silence created by the snow. Vel, Piper, her brother, and the pirates screamed as red ship-turned-sleigh flew through the air with all the grace of a cannonball. The bow of the vessel collided into a newly erected statue of Chester, decapitating it neatly, before slamming into the stone veranda of the college. The ship tipped on its side and slid along the icy surface, smashed through the second floor, and finally screeched to a stop in the old council chambers. Atticus sat up, his green nightcap sliding slowly off his head.
That was amazing!
Vel looked up from his prone position on the cold marble floor of the college halls. His mechanical fingers dug into inch-thick ice as he pushed himself up to his knees. Piper was nearby, a little battered and bruised, but otherwise unharmed. Leon pushed his unconscious first mate off his lap and sat up. He leveled a scowl on the girl, shaking his hook in her direction.
Lass, that'd be the last time you step foot on one of my ships. It's not good for me health.
Vel watched as his heavy breathing turned to fog in the chill air. A tremor rippled through him, having lost his tarp somewhere during his death-defying hurdle over the college walls.
Does it feel colder in here?
He didn't need Amy's assessment of his rapidly dropping body temperature, but she gleefully provided it anyway. Piper nodded as she climbed to her feet, unable to stop the chattering of her teeth.
Definitely. Everything is coated in ice.
She clamped her hands around herself, trying to persuade what little warmth she had to remain. Atticus pulled the furry hem of his green coat up around his neck.
Yeah, that would be the weather inducer. It's creating an artificial cold front by slowing down the ambient air molecules in the immediate vicinity. It's only going to get worse the closer we get.
Vel stifled down another shiver. He wasn't exactly dressed for this encounter, and by the looks of Piper's shaking, neither was she. He looked around, his eyes landing on a box that had broken free from the wreckage of the ship. The lid had been jostled open upon impact, and several hastily tailored green garments were strewn about. He stumbled over and began rifling through the contents, tossing some over to Piper that he felt would fit her. After a few minutes of picky discerning, Vel finally found one that was large enough to go over his shoulders. Unfortunately, it was red and lined with a white fur trimming. He closed his eyes as he sighed. It's either look like Santa or freeze to death, he thought as he slid his arms into the coat.
All right, you two stay here with the pirates, and I'll find and...
I'm coming with. If F4-057Y is damaged, I might need to repair him.
Atticus plucked up his nightcap and shoved it on his head before jumping to his feet. Vel grumbled under his breath and turned to the girl.
Would it do any good to tell you to stay here?
Piper scoffed as she fastened the coat around her chest.
Ha! Listen, old man. I go where he goes, all right?
She gestured at her brother, who was lost in thought. Vel rolled his eyes.
Fine. Which way, kid?
Well, technically it's on the roof, but we can only get to it from the eastern stairwell, next to the agricultural augmentation wing.
They waved off the pirates, who were busy kindling a fire from several scraps of wooden planks, and started off down the icy halls. The storm was threatening to blot out the sun, despite it being midday. The farther into the school they got, the thicker the ice grew. The walls glittered and glistened in the flickering overhead lights, and the floors were beginning to resemble an ice skating rink.
Calculating optimal route.
Amy constructed a 3D map in Vel's field of vision, giving him a layout of the entire college. A pulsing red line snaked through several corridors and rooms before reaching the indicated stairwell. Thankfully, they were already on the second floor, leaving them with only a handful of rooms and halls to traverse.
Looks like this'll be the fastest way.
He gestured to a room at the end of the corridor, as indicated by his map. After sliding around on the slick floors, they managed to reach the end of the hall. Vel grabbed the handle and pulled. Except the entire thing broke off, splintering in his grasp. Piper raised a brow as the entire handle shattered into 1,000 shards of frozen metal.
Well, that's new.
She looked up at the cyborg, silently asking him what their next move was. Vel growled as he opened his mechanical hand, flexing the stiff joints. It wouldn't be long before the mechanical parts of his body seized up. Synthetic tissues and micropistons don't like the cold. They would have to hurry. He pulled back on his arm and smashed his fist into the door. The ice split and cracked. He gave the door another pummel, and another, until the frozen barrier shattered under his knuckles. The door gave a groan of protest, but still didn't budge. He let out another frustrated sigh and pushed Piper and her brother back before ramming the heel of his boot into the door. The frozen hinges crumbled, and the door fell to the ground without further complaint.
This is going to take longer than I thought.
1 door down, 7 to go.
Damn it, Amy. You're not helping.
Chapter 3. Do You Want to Fight a Snowman? Piper absently worked on flexing the fingers of her new hand as she watched Vel pummel his fist against the door. Only one more to go, but the cyborg was growing tired, she could tell. Or perhaps it was the cold. The closer they got to the machine, the thicker the ice had become. This particular room glinted like a giant crystal chandelier with massive icicles reaching down from the ceiling like the teeth of a monstrous creature. Piper shivered and tugged her coat up tighter around herself.
So, is Christmas always this dangerous back in your world?
Vel slammed his fist into the door again. Beneath the thick layer of ice, he could make out the words, roof access. They were so close, but the increasing cold was starting to affect him. His shoulders reverberated painfully with every punch, and his cybernetic vision would flicker and fritz with each impact. It took him a moment to register the question, and he considered it as he pulled back on his arm, ignoring the clicking sounds it made.
I guess that depends on how much of your family shows up.
Vel leaned into the punch and watched a fissure form in the thick ice before he slumped against the frozen door. His labored breathing came out in rapid puffs of steam in the cold air. He felt a quiver in his knees as he forced himself back upright, grinding down on his resolve. One last door, he thought, as he slammed his knuckles into the middle of the fissure. Atticus could see that the punches were doing less damage with each attempt. He stifled a shudder and moved closer, sliding a little on the ice.
Vel, are you okay?
Systems malfunctioning.
Vel barely registered the flashing warning before his vision in that eye flickered, glitched, and suddenly went black. His arms slumped to the sides, and the ground pitched sideways. His knees buckled under the weight of his own body, and he collapsed to the ground in a heap. He could hear the panicked cries from the two kids, but was too cold to respond. He was going to freeze to death in the halls of this school, unable to stop the machine.
What do we do?
Atticus turned a frantic face to his sister. From his prone position, Vel could hear the reverberation through the floor of something crashing through the halls towards them. He tried to mumble a warning through blue, cracked lips, but the vibrations quickly grew into an audible roar that drowned him out. He let out a shaky breath and pulled himself together. He forced his good arm beneath him, pushing himself up to his knees.
Get Behind me.
Piper shot him an incredulous look as she moved in front of him.
What are you going to do? Glare at it?
She wasn't much of a fighter, but Piper was damned sure whatever was coming wasn't going to make it to her brother. With some effort, she managed to force her new metal hand into a fist and held it at the ready. A large shape began to form out of the shadows. A burst of adrenaline hit her system, and she readied her attack. Atticus ran past her, jumping up to wrap his arms around the creature.
Unit 2!
Piper deflated like a balloon, the tension flooding out of her.
About time you showed up.
Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the cyborg slump back to the ground in a heap.
Think you could give us a hand with that door? Vel's not doing too good.
Unit 2 approached the door, his motorized treads crunching the ice beneath him.
Of course, ma'am. It would be my pleasure.
He took a moment to pull the cyborg off the ground, slinging him over his shoulder. Then he squared himself up, raised his free hand, and threw a tiny fist into the center of the fissure, again and again in rapid succession. He chiseled away the ice until the door, quite literally, burst off its hinges. Piper moved up behind Unit 2 to look in Vel's eyes.
Oh, you all right?
She watched as his blinks became more lethargic. Vel managed to nod. His vision was still dark in one eye, and he had no control of his arm. The complex nature of his cybernetics couldn't withstand buildup of ice, but his artificial heart seemed to still be functioning. There was that, at least. Piper nodded back, giving him a look she hoped conveyed confidence, and moved around Unit 2 to enter the stairwell. The cold blast of air hit her like a runaway sleigh, and an involuntary shudder nearly took her off her feet. She grit her teeth and began to climb the stairs, Atticus and Unit 2 close behind. She was surprised the robot could handle the incline so well, but his treads seemed to grip the sharp corners of the stairs without much difficulty, only slipping occasionally. Before long, Piper stepped out onto what she had assumed was the roof, but it looked more like what she imagined the inside of a bubble would be. A thin glass globe had been erected around a large portion of the roof, with a complex machine stationed in the middle. Gale force winds were buffeting them with frozen air and tiny, razor-sharp ice particles. But among the noise of the machine, the snow, and the wind, she could hear a deep mechanical voice singing, poorly.
When they placed a hat upon my head, I began to dance around.
Piper watched as another robot rolled out from between the two large pillars that were pumping snow into the air. Its body was completely covered in thick white frost, with a length of red fabric tied around where its neck should have been, and a small black top hat on its head. Its glowing orange eyes were flickering sporadically, neither one quite matching the pattern of the other.
I was alive as I could be, and the children said, all must perish.
Vel shook his head, still a little delirious from hypothermia.
That's not how the song goes.
Piper turned to her brother.
What did you do to this robot?
Atticus was holding on to his hat with one hand, the other clenching the fur hem of his coat.
What do you mean? I didn't do anything to him. The weather inducer shouldn't affect his personality like this.
Piper looked from her brother to the malfunctioning robot and up to her semi-conscious friend. She lifted her own mechanical hand and flexed her fingers. The cold wasn't affecting her prosthetic in the same way it had Vel, meaning it was up to her. She took a steadying breath and turned to Unit 2.
You gotta distract him while I turn off the machine.
Unit 2 hefted Vel off his shoulder and slumped him against a raised portion of the roof.
I will do my best, Mom.
So let's run and have some fun before you freeze solid.
Unit 2 spun and zipped forward with surprising speed, swinging out with one of his arms, striking the machine in an attempt to distract the other robot. FR-057Y ducked out of the way and leveled its tiny black eyes on Unit 2.
And I hollered, stop!
Piper watched as the two moved closer, like two wrestlers in a ring sizing each other up. She circled around to the weather machine, which was still happily spitting out snow, and located the main panel. There were dozens of levers, buttons, and cranks. She shot an exasperated look at her brother across the roof.
Could you, for once, have just a big button that says off or something?
Atticus looked confused and hollered back,
What do you mean?
Piper pointed an accusing finger at the control panel.
I mean, how do I turn this off? It's the big red lever with the off written beneath it.
Piper scanned the panel again. Sure enough, beneath the layer of ice was a clearly labeled, large red lever. She sheepishly grabbed hold of the handle and pulled. It didn't move. Like everything else, it was frozen stuck. She raised her mechanical hand, gripped the lever, and hauled back. It snapped clean off at the base. She swallowed hard and looked over her shoulder at Atticus. She could see out of the corner of her eye, Unit 2 wasn't faring so well against his mad brother.
Thumpity-thump-thump.
FR-057Y was pummeling Unit 2 with tiny balled fists, connecting each hit with a portion of his song.
Look at Frosty go.
Facing the broad back of the other robot, she realized Unit 2 wouldn't last much longer without help. Piper flexed her mechanical fingers around the middle shaft of the lever, a feat that was becoming easier with each passing moment. One shot at this, she told herself.
Punching here and there, saying catch me if you can.
Piper threw herself into the fray, slamming 1 foot square on the topmost part of the other robot's treads, and launched herself up. Her mechanical fingers wrapped tightly around her lever like a club, and she swung it into the back of the robot's head, shattering the rest of the lever and sending the small top hat flying off its head. She landed in the snow at the base of the machine. FR-057Y shook its tiny head, as if clearing itself from a bad thought.
Ah, Unit 2, it is so good to see you again. And you brought guests. Should I put on a kettle?
His tiny hands were still raised and balled into fists. Atticus whooped and jumped in the air.
Way to go, Piper! You fixed him! Pity about the lever, though. We kind of needed that.
Piper scrabbled to her feet, turning to look at the weather machine.
How do we shut it down?
Atticus scratched his head.
Unfortunately, the field of destructive interference is created by introducing an opposing longitudinal wave to the existing pattern of air molecules, created by a resonance of a...
Piper shook her head as she tuned out her brother. If there was one lesson she had learned from Vel, it was that there is always an easier way to shut down a machine. She gave herself a half smile, clenched her mechanical hand closed, and slammed it as hard as she could through the thick layer of ice and into the frozen control panel. The weather machine gave a feeble sputter, and for a brief moment, she thought she had done it. The snow stopped erupting from the spouts of the machine, the coils at the base stopped churning, and the deep thrum grew silent. Atticus stopped rambling.
Oh, that's not good.
Piper wrenched free her fist from the sparking panel and shook off the shards of ice. But her brief moment of victory was shattered as the machine jolted back to life with a violent tremble. The tubes that served as an exhaust port for the snow were now sucking air in. The device gave a violent shudder, and more snow was being pulled in. The globe around them began to vibrate and hum. She could feel her boots start to skidding across the ice. It was pulling her in as well. Before she could even react, Unit 2 latched a metal hand around her wrist and hauled her in, shielding her as it made its way to her brother, sheltering them both from the storm as the weather machine rocked violently on its base. Air whipped around them. The very oxygen inside the globe seemed to be sucked clear, and just as it threatened to pull them all inside, just when Piper thought she could take no more, there was a small thwump, and the building pressure exploded outward. The glass dome shattered, and a burst of energy erupted into the clouds. The silence that followed was deafening.
Oh, God, I'm dead again,
Piper thought as she kept her clenched eyes shut. But something warm caressed her cheek, and she pulled her hands away from her head to turn and face it. The midday sun was beating down on them through a crisp, clear blue sky, without a single cloud in sight. A warm breeze wafted in from the east, as if the storm had never happened. Piper laughed as she turned to her brother.
We did it!
Atticus grimaced.
You did it. I just made a mess of things.
Piper took her brother's hand and led him over to the edge of the roof. They looked around to see much of the city had been blanketed with a thick dusting of snow, but doors were opening, and families and children were spilling out into the streets to investigate the glittering white powder. Before long, they could hear laughter and cries of delight. Piper put an arm around her brother and squeezed his shoulder.
Look at what you brought these people. I'd say you did a pretty good job for your first Christmas.
Atticus smiled, but it dampened slightly as he glanced over to the pair of robots.
I still can't figure out what happened to FR-057Y. Why did he go all crazy?
Magnets and computers don't mix, kid.
They both turned to see Vel sitting up in the snow, trying his hardest to pull a metal top hat off his cybernetic arm. With a mighty tug, he managed to get the thing dislodged before it zipped across the roof and stuck to a metal vent.
You're alive!
Piper couldn't force down the tone of relief as she watched her friend get to his feet.
Don't look so surprised. It'll take a lot more than a little bit of snow to stop me.
Vel dusted off the front of his borrowed coat and moved over to the edge of the roof with them. He looked out at the town below and could see children playing in the streets, pulling each other along on whatever they could find that would slide. He felt a smile tug at the corners of his mouth, and he turned back to the others.
You did a good thing here, kid, even if it was a little scary at first.
Vel turned to Piper to congratulate her, but the praise was short-lived as a snowball splattered him hard in the face. His shoulders fell as he scooped the wet powder from his eyes. Atticus pointed at his sister.
Piper did it!
She giggled, but the smile faded as she watched Vel bend over and start balling snow into his hands, a wicked grin sneaking across his lips.
Amy, activate combat assistance mode.
The Christmas Commodore is a holiday short story by Lesley Herron, involving the characters from her serialized novel of Tyrants and Teakettles. If you would like to listen to the entire book, you can find it at talltaletv.com/series.
This, Atticus, this is why you are supposed to clear large-scale projects with me ahead of time.
But then it wouldn't be a surprise.
Trade halted, dozens of fires, an illegally requisitioned military skiff in ruins, untold damage to multiple streets, and no less than seven doors knocked off their hinges in the college. Yes, I would say I was surprised.
You, forgot about the statue.
No, you're just lucky I wasn't fond of it to begin with. It made me look ostentatious. In that small regard, I owe you my thanks.
Well, then you're welcome, and Merry Christmas!
Yes, Merry Christmas, whatever it is. Just tell me there aren't any other holidays coming up that you have plans for.
Well, there was this one called Halloween, where all sorts of monsters and zombies go around demanding candy. Or maybe brains. I can't remember now. But I was thinking I could create a super virus to change all the local animals and people into scary things.
I think I need a vacation.
Oh, maybe we could put the antidote in the candy.